Hello, friends, and welcome to the PrepWell podcast. I'm your host, Phil Black. And if you have an 8th, 9th, or 10th grader with big aspirations, like the Ivy League, or military service academies like West Point, ROTC, or athletic scholarships, boom, you've come to the right place. My specialty, my superpower, if you will, is preparing families for these competitive programs. I'll teach you what your child should do, when they should do it, and how you can help. So stick around and prepare to out-prepare. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the PrepWell podcast. In case you haven't heard, the College Board recently announced that it is changing the format and administration of the SAT test. This is pretty big news, and I wanted to walk you through what has changed, what has stayed the same, and who the winners and losers might be once these changes are rolled out. Now, before we get into the details, understand that none of this is set in stone yet. There are a lot of details that need to be filled in. There's still a lot of moving pieces and parts, and there's a lot that can change between now and the next 1.5 to 2.5 years. So don't get too excited, but don't get too worried either. Now let's start with, at a very high level, whether or not your child may be impacted by this development. Let's start with this year's seniors. If you have a senior in high school, obviously the ship has sailed. Your child has already applied to college. Some have already been admitted if they applied early admission or early decisions. Most are still waiting to hear back, so you're in the clear, zero impact. How about juniors? If you have a junior in high school, you're also in the clear. These changes won't take effect before your child applies to college, which is in about 6 months, so no impact for them either. How about sophomores? Sophomores will also miss this change, barely. And then there's freshmen. If you have a freshman in high school, this change will impact him or her. They will be taking a digital PSAT in the fall of 2023. That's going to be their junior year, and a digital SAT in the spring of 2024, which is also in their junior year. What about middle schoolers? Yes, they will certainly be part of the new SAT format, assuming things go according to plan. Now, a lot can happen between now and then, so again, I wouldn't worry about it too much, but just know that some of these changes are brewing. For those of you interested in the specific proposed dates of the changes, as opposed to just the affected age groups, here we go. For international students, the new SAT will start in the spring of 2023. That's about a year and a half from now. For U.S. students, the new digital SAT will start in the spring of 2024. That's almost 2.5 years from now. And the first PSAT will be administered in the fall of 2023. That's about 2 years from now. So the bottom line is, the earliest thing that anything will happen, even if it's according to plan, is about 1.5 years for international students and between 2 to 2.5 years from now for U.S. students. So this is not imminent. And by the way, maybe you all got this, but just to be clear, we're only talking about the SAT right now, not the ACT, at least not yet. The ACT will not change how they administer their tests for the time being. Now, how quickly the ACT responds to the SAT going fully digital and how they respond, that's going to be a different story, and that probably will happen sooner rather than later, but I'll keep you informed on that. Okay, with all of this in mind, what is it about the new digital SAT that is changing? And then we'll talk about what's remaining the same, and then we'll try to make through who the winners and losers might be. So what about the SAT is changing? Number one, the test will be administered 100% digitally. No number 2 pencils, no paper, no Scantrons. Number two, students can use their own laptop, their own personal laptop. Or if they don't have a personal laptop, one will be provided for them. Number three, the new test is shorter. It's 2 hours instead of 3 hours. So they've shaved an hour off the test. Number 4, you will have more time per question. Number 5, the reading passages are shorter, and there's a limit of 1 question per passage. Now, right now, there's sometimes a passage that's 5 or 6 paragraphs long, followed by 3 or 4 or 5 questions on that long passage. That's not happening anymore. Short passage, 1 question per passage. Number 6, calculators can be used on all math questions. As it stands now, there's one section of math where you can use a calculator and one that you are not permitted to use a calculator. Well, on the new SAT, calculators all around. Number 7, the test is adaptive, meaning not everyone gets the same questions in the same order. So if you're fast and you're accurate, you're going to get deeper and deeper into the more difficult questions faster. If you get a bunch of questions wrong early, it will start to ratchet down the difficulty of the questions. They'll get easier and easier until you catch up. Now, we'll talk about what the ramifications of that might mean, but it does make it tougher to cheat because not everybody will be working off the same questions. Number 8, there's a quicker turnaround time for getting your scores. Now it's sometimes 4, 5, even 6 weeks before you get your scores. With the new SAT, it's going to be a matter of days before you get your results back. Number 9, theoretically, in a digital format, there should be more flexibility in testing dates, in scheduling, and locations, which might be nice. Number 10, generally speaking, proponents say that the test should be easier to take for students and easier to administer for proctors. And lastly, number 11, the content of the test will be purportedly, quote unquote, more relevant to a broader set of students. Not really sure what that means. It is said to be more student-friendly or pedagogically more relevant. I'm not sure what any of that means. I have no idea. Many continue to demand that the test must become more, quote, equitable. I'm not sure what that means either. Your guess is as good as mine. Is it testing something new or different? I have no idea. Time is going to tell on that one too. And I know the students out there, their primary question is, will it be easier? Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by easier. Presumably, it will be easier to find a testing site because the logistics won't be as tough to handle, and hopefully there'll be more availability of testing sites and testing dates. Some students might find a digital test to be easier than a paper test. They might feel more comfortable with the digital technology today. Does the use of a calculator mean that the math section will be easier? Not necessarily. I guess you might consider a 2-hour test easier than a 3-hour test, but I think the jury's out on that. Is running a mile really that much easier than running 2 miles? It depends on how hard you have to run, about the intensity of that running. Will the actual test questions be easier? Maybe. I don't know. But if they're too easy, everyone's going to get a 1600. And maybe that's what they're shooting for. Maybe that's what they mean by equity. I don't know. If that's the case, and everybody's getting a 1600, theoretically, I doubt that colleges will pay any attention to the scores, because what would be the point? I don't really think that students should be focused on, or they should really care that much about whether the content is going to be easier or harder. Remember, this is still a few years away. There's certainly going to be an adjustment period. And for those students on the bubble, or those trying to decide between a traditional ACT and the new digital SAT, let's table that for the time being. Let's leave that discussion to the side for even a year and a half. Let's let this thing play out, and then we'll come back and address that. Let's change gears to what is not changing, what's remaining the same on the new digital SAT. Well, for one, students must still take the test at an official testing site. You're not allowed to be at home on your laptop, at least not yet. You have to go to a testing site. Number 2, there are still 2 main sections. There's a math section and a verbal section. Nothing's changed there. And lastly, the score is still based on a 1600 scale, each of the 2 sections accounting for 800 points each. So with all of these changes and all of these things that are staying the same, who are conceivably the winners and the losers? Let's start with the potential winners. And I say potential because, again, we're not exactly sure that this is all going to roll out exactly as planned, but let's just make a guess right now that if things go pretty much according to plan, who could potentially be the winners? Well, for one, highly competitive students who, no matter what the test looks like, will prepare ahead of time. They will prepare hard and well, and they will do well on the test. And they'll be able to show colleges their scores. They'll be potential winners. Now, if the SAT score happens to become required again, then they will really be in good shape because then they'll be able to show what they know. Number two, in list of potential winners, the ACT. The ACT may find themselves with a flood of new test takers who may have traditionally opted for the SAT, but they don't like the idea of a digital exam, and they would prefer a traditional or a familiar paper-based exam. Because the College Board right now, the College Board is the one that creates the SAT, they have no plan for an overlap between the digital and the paper test. It's just going to be cold turkey. When they flip the switch, it's over. It's one day is going to be traditional paper, the next day it's digital from there on out. This transition may open up opportunities for the ACT to pick up market share from the students who are scared to be the guinea pig in the first new SAT. Speaking of market share, the College Board's aggressive move to this digital format may help them get an early jump on locking in high school districts who may want to make this test mandatory in their high schools. And the reason it's easier to lock in high schools is because it's much easier for high schools to commit to giving this test to all of their students if it's digital. Just the administrative burden is a lot less. So if the SAT goes in this direction, they may have a land grab for a lot of high schools that say, yeah, we'll do it. Looks like it's easier. It's 20% of the personnel that we need to administer the test. So there may be an upside for them in that regard. Who else could potentially benefit? How about students who would normally have access to a limited number of testing sites, but now with the new digital format, they have more availability. They have more test sites. They have more actual days where the SAT is being provided. We're not sure how that's all going to work out, but if there are more testing sites and more availability dates, there may be students who didn't have that flexibility, and now they have more flexibility. How about the freshman class of 2025? The students in that cohort who are strong test takers, and they're motivated and eager to take an early traditional SAT in the beginning of their junior year, which is what I advocate for in PrepWell Academy, they can hedge their bets by taking one of the last paper-based SATs in September or October of their junior year in an attempt to lock in a high score, and then take their chances with the new digital format in the spring of their junior year, a couple of months later. That way, if the digital test doesn't really work out for them or colleges don't like what the results are, they can always revert back to their initial paper test score that they took in the beginning of their junior year. So those freshmen class of 2025 might be able to hedge their bets and try to get a good score on both. Who else is a potential winner? Well, how about the SAT tutoring companies? New formats and confusion, they often lead to families seeking out professional advice, which leads to more business for the SAT tutoring companies. How about the College Board? Again, they're the ones that are creating this new SAT. They may be able to offer more test dates because of expedited turnaround and how quickly they can grade these things. And that might encourage more students to register and take more tests because they get the results back faster and they're more available test dates. The College Board also may be a winner if this new digital format stops the momentum that's building toward test optional or test blind policies. Because right now, we are in a doomsday scenario for the College Board and for the ACT for that matter. Because we're moving so far away from those tests being required, we're almost moving to the point where they're not going to be necessary at all. And if we stay on this trajectory, where most colleges aren't requiring SAT scores, the College Board stands to lose hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue. The College Board, and the makers of the ACT for that matter, they're desperate to keep this standardized test train relevant and alive and moving. There's millions and millions of dollars at stake. Now, the College Board has beaten the ACT to the punch on this move to digital. Will this give colleges a reason to begin expecting or maybe even requiring test scores again? I don't know. But if it's a big success and the ACT and SAT become not only test optional but required again, they could be the big winners. Who else is this a potential bonus for? Well, students, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, they're going to get quicker feedback on their scores. It's going to be a few days before they get their score back. So that may mean that they have the ability to take more tests or to figure out how much more they need to study sooner rather than later. They get quicker feedback. And also, they're not agonizing for weeks and weeks and weeks over how well or how poorly they did. And the last group that this may be a positive for are students who do very well on the new digital version of the test. They may be at an advantage, as most people are when they do well on things. That is, assuming that colleges think that these newfangled tests are legitimate. And I say that they may be at an advantage, that is, those students who do well on this test, because if everyone does well on the test, then there's once again no way to differentiate among students. Everybody's the same. All right, let's talk about potential losers in this scenario. Who may this new trend not really benefit? Well, first off, the ACT, they're the competitor to the College Board who does the SAT. The ACT may be a loser because if this new SAT works and they don't catch up quickly enough, there could be a huge land grab for the SAT. So we'll see how they respond. On the other hand, a potential loser could also be the SAT, because if they lose a lot of students who would normally have taken the SAT to the ACT because they don't want to be the guinea pigs for the new digital SAT, then they could lose a lot of market share to the ACT. Something similar happened to this during the last significant overhaul to the SAT when they changed the scoring convention from 1,600 to 2,400. A lot of students freaked out and they ended up moving over to the ACT and never moving back. So these things are not without risk. And again, there are going to be winners and losers. Who else could be a loser in this situation? Well, what I will call the quote unquote, it's unfair advocates. Because if the College Board tweaks the test to be, quote, easier and more accessible and shorter and less stressful and adaptive in the hopes that more under-resourced students will take the test and do better on the test, what happens if they don't do better on the test? What happens if there continues to be a stratification in the score, a bell curve, if you will, that happens to align with a certain race or gender or demographic? If the test is now shorter, more relevant, and adaptive, why are some kids still doing poorly and others are excelling? What other excuse are they going to have to put their hands around? Who else might be a loser here? Well, the new SAT might be a loser if they get the scoring conventions wrong, because the SAT test score will still be based on the number of questions answered correctly. However, a low-scoring student in the first section is likely to get more questions right on the second section because the difficulty of the questions will automatically go down. That's the adaptive part. If you do not so well in the first part, they're going to get easier in the second part, and then you may get more questions right than somebody who got a lot of questions right on the first part, but then got hammered because the difficulty went way up and they got a lot of questions wrong on the second half. So how are they going to be able to make those scores make any sense with this new adaptive testing process? Now, presumably they'll work that out with some kind of differential or algorithm or something, but that is a concern if the scores don't seem to be valid. Now, who else could be potential losers? Well, I, off the top of my head, came up with several categories of students that could be losers with this new digital SAT. Number one, the lazy student who would prefer not to study at all for any test, and they would prefer to take their chances in the application process that doesn't consider standardized test scores. So if this new SAT takes hold and all of a sudden it becomes a requirement again, then those students who could care less about that, they're going to be at a disadvantage because they can't hide behind a test optional policy. Okay, what other student group could be losers in this scenario? How about the guinea pigs? The early adopters of the test, the people who take it the first time around before it goes through its trials and gets tweaked, their score may not reflect the score that they would have gotten on a more traditional paper-based test. So that may not be great for them. How about the student athletes who would rather stick with the test optional policies like they are today, where schools can look the other way at an athlete who chooses not to submit an SAT or ACT score? Again, if this new SAT starts to take hold and colleges start requiring this again, the athletes might want to go back to the way it is now, which is they don't have to submit anything if they don't want to. How about international students? It used to be, and I know this is harsh to say, but it used to be that international students could cheat on the test a little bit easier when it was a paper-based test. But now that it's adaptive and not everybody's going to have the same question sequence, that's going to be harder for international students. Another group of students who this may not advantage are students who continue to perform poorly on a supposedly easier and less stressful test. That's not going to do well if they continue to do poorly on a supposedly easier test. How about the less tech-savvy students who are less familiar with a digital testing environment, or they don't have robust computer resources at their school like some other schools have? That may be a tougher time for them to deal with a digital testing. How about current freshmen? This is the class of 2025. They're going to be sophomores in October of 2022, and they're not going to get the chance to take a digital version of the PSAT as a sophomore. They may have a tougher time scoring well on the more consequential digital PSAT in 11th grade the next year. And that's the more important one, because that's the one, if you do well on, you can get a National Merit Scholarship recognition or award or even money. So those freshmen will have to take the PSAT, the digital PSAT in 11th grade without ever taking it before. And that may affect on whether they get a National Merit Scholarship award or not. And that could be tough. And lastly, how about homeschooled students? They may get the raw end of the deal here, because if test administration starts to consolidate toward in-school testing as opposed to on the weekends, because students like it better and high schools like it better, especially if it's digital, it's going to be easier to monitor. They'd rather just do it in school. If that's the case, the in-school students would get priority for all the seats when they're giving the test, and the homeschoolers who aren't attached to a high school, they may have a tougher time finding seats because they don't always have a high school that they can roll into and find a seat for that. Presumably they'll work that out. Now, that was a lot. There's a lot of detail there. For those of you who aren't thinking that far ahead, let me boil it down to what you really need to think about. For one, the only student cohort in PrepWell Academy who this will materially impact are this year's freshmen, class of 2025. And since none of this will have any consequence for at least 2 years, even for those freshmen, let's just file this away for now. We will see soon enough what happens when the dust settles. The best thing that you as a student can do is, number one, pay close attention in your math class and push yourself to really master the foundational pieces of math. And two, become an avid reader. That's it. If you do those two things for the next 2 years, it won't matter a damn what the SAT looks like, whether it's digital or not, whether you can use a calculator or not, whether it's 2 hours, 1 hour, 4 hours, how easy or hard it ends up. Who cares? None of that will matter. Remember, control your controllables, which are how much you work on your math skills and how much of a reader you can turn into. The rest will take care of itself, to the upside and to the downside. And rest assured, I will be back to you with more details and strategies as these developments unfold. That's all I've got for you today, folks. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the continued support. If you know a parent, particularly with a 6th grader, 7th grader, 8th grader, 9th grader in high school that might find this helpful, please share this episode with them. You can do that by finding that small box with a tiny arrow pointing up. That's the share button. Click that button, text your friends a link to this episode with a little personal note from you recommending that they give it a listen. If you have questions, comments, or an idea for an upcoming episode, please reach out to me by email, DM me on Instagram, check out our blog, Facebook, connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from you. Until next week, goodbye, good luck, and never stop preparing. This podcast is brought to you by PrepWell Academy. PrepWell Academy is my one-of-a-kind online mentoring program that delivers to your 9th or 10th grader a short, highly relevant video from me every week, every Sunday, in fact, where I give them a heads up about what they should be thinking about to stay ahead of the game. To get these valuable lessons into your child's hands, please head over to PrepWellAcademy.com and enroll your child today.